I'm thrilled that you're all here tonight. My name is Sonia Epstein, and I am the Museum of the Moving Images executive editor of Science and Film and associate curator for Science and Film. For those of you who haven't been to the Queen's Drive-In before, it is a partnership between three nonprofit organizations: the Museum of the Moving Image, Rooftop Films, and the New York Hall of Science, whose building you'll see illuminated by a beautiful blue light next door as it begins to get dark. I want to thank the park and the Parks Department for allowing us to be here and do this. We opened last August, and we have been here since. We'll be running shows through the end of June. So I encourage all of you to come back and check out our website, sign up for our mailing list, follow us on all the socials. We're always adding new stuff. I want to thank the Queensborough President, Donovan Richards, Phil Ballmer, the Director of Cultural Affairs, our friends at Showtime. You just saw a trailer for their new show, Flappish Misdemeanors. We'll be doing a special screening of that here coming up, I believe, on May 20th. Tonight's series is very specially supported by a great foundation called the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, a nonprofit philanthropy founded in 1934 that supports, among other things, public understanding of science. They are supporting this and two other upcoming series. We're going to be showing Gravity on May 30th with an introduction by astronaut Karen Nyberg, the 50th woman in space, who spent 180 days up there and was actually living on the International Space Station when Gravity was released. So I encourage you to come back for that, or on June 4th, we'll be showing The Host, the Bong Joon-ho breakout monster movie, and that'll be introduced by a specialist in zoonotic spillover. Specifically, she studies bats. So that's going to be really fun. Again, you can find out more on queensdrivein.com. Now I will transition to tonight's program. We're going to see two very different yet related great films that I'm excited to share with you all. The first of those is the PBS documentary, The Polio Crusade, which has some bearing, I thought, on the current, economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, some of the social stigma surrounding epidemics, and also the vaccine rollout. That will precede Danny Boyle's groundbreaking zombie film Reimagining 28 Days Later, a fantastic film that I think will look really great on this big screen that we have. For those who haven't seen it or who don't know, 28 Days Later is one of the most influential horror films of, the 21st century. It was a smash hit when it came out in 2002, and among other things, helped make its writer, Alex Garland, famous. He then went on to write and direct Ex Machina and Annihilation. Tonight, we are extremely lucky to be joined by infectious disease epidemiologist Caitlin Rivers, who will give a short intro to the program. Dr. Rivers works at Johns Hopkins Center for Health and Security, which advises U.S. and international leaders on epidemics. Her research focuses on improving public health preparedness and response, particularly by improving capabilities for outbreak science and infectious disease modeling to support public health decision-making. So please join me in giving a warm, honking welcome to Dr. Caitlin Rivers. To start, maybe you can just tell us a little bit what the focus of your job is at the moment and what outbreak science is.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for having me. I think this is a really great event. I am an infectious disease epidemiologist, which I think is a job that many more people are familiar with now than they would have been 18 months ago. But I study infectious diseases in populations, and I specialize, even in normal years, in epidemics, pandemics, and deliberately occurring events. And so the last year plus has been a whirlwind of trying to help the country and the world through the pandemic in what little ways I can, by providing guidance and expertise. I've done a lot in the United States around developing policies and practices for things like stay-at-home orders, mask orders, now thankfully moving out of those orders into something that looks more like normal life. And I'm really pleased with the progress that the United States is making. But even as we enter calmer waters, the rest of the world is not so fortunate. And so now starting to turn my attention to the global situation. Outbreak science is, use it specifically to think about how modeling and analytics can help support this public health decision-making. And I think of it a lot like how the National Weather Service is able to provide forecasts and a look around the corner of what's happening with the weather and how people use that to make decisions about what to do in their daily lives. Individuals may choose to bring an umbrella or skip going to the beach, but airlines also use that to make decisions about their routings. And the military uses it to make decisions about operations. We could come to do that in the US but for infectious disease forecasting if we have the capabilities to really do that forecast and get them out to the public. And I'm really excited that the Biden administration has announced an intention to create a national center for epidemic forecasting and outbreak analytics, which hopefully will be like the National Weather Center, but for infectious diseases. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how that unfolds.
Tonight, we're going to see two films. There's a documentary about a real virus, the polio virus, and a fictional depiction of a virus. In general, can you tell us, how is there a sort of consistent way that viruses typically spread, and what is vaccination usually, sort of the main intervention that can help it, or what are some other ways?
SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID, spreads through droplets and through small particles in the air that can float. And so it's when you're in close contact with someone or in a space that's not well ventilated that you are at highest risk. To a lesser degree, there is some risk also with contaminated surfaces. If you touch a turnstile while commuting, for example, and then maybe have a snack, probably not the time for that during this pandemic, but that is also a possible route of transmission. But there's lots of other ways that viruses can spread. Some of them spread through contact with mosquitoes or other vectors. Sexual contact is a common mode of transmission. Waterborne and foodborne illness are common as well. And so there's lots of different ways that people can become infected with various viruses.
I'm interested in this center that you told us about. Would it be tracking, how would it go about necessarily tracking all the different forms of that a virus can take and all the different ways that it could spread? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there are a set of viruses that we are particularly concerned about. Seasonal influenza comes around every year, and then about every 2 years, but of course it varies, there's some other virus or some other disease that threatens us in some way. Most recently, before COVID, there was the Zika virus, which is spread by mosquitoes. There was a large outbreak of Ebola in 2014 in West Africa. And so what this center would do is do things like forecast how many cases could be expected in the next 2 weeks. They could compare different interventions to say which might be more helpful or which should be prioritized. And it would also communicate with the public about what to expect and how you could keep yourself and your family safe. You had mentioned earlier, are vaccines a common way that we control viruses? Yes, if we're lucky enough to have a vaccine at hand. But for many diseases, particularly new ones like COVID, when it emerged, there's not a vaccine available. And so it can be really helpful to use models to identify which non-pharmaceutical or non-vaccine interventions may be most effective and most cost effective.
So by that, you mean things like social distancing and masks and things like that?
Those are the things that we have all really adopted this year in our everyday lives. But during smaller events, when that may not be required, it may be something like, do we need to surge additional hospital beds to a particular area because that area is becoming more problematic? Should we close schools in a particular jurisdiction, but not as wide of a scale? I think one way that models and analytics can be really helpful is to tailor those interventions so they're not so disruptive. There was a lot of discussion after the spring when really the whole country moved to shut down, but not all areas of the country were equally affected. I think if we had a better sense of where the virus was and where it was going, next time we could probably make more narrow decisions and minimize that disruption.
So that dovetails on sort of the last question that I wanted to ask you, which is, sort of takeaways. I mean, we're obviously far from the end of this pandemic, but, if there were some things that you think might come out of it that might help us in the future, or even looking to the past, to past outbreaks like the 1918 influenza or the polio virus, things that maybe we could have learned that we didn't, or that we might hope to learn from this one.
Yeah, I think there's great inspiration to be had in the polio eradication campaign, actually, which is, I think, the subject of the film that you are watching first tonight. Polio is one of the candidate diseases for eradication, which means we are trying to completely eliminate it from the world. There is only one disease, human disease, that we have managed to do that for, and that is smallpox, which was eradicated around 1980. And since then, we've been after a couple diseases. Polio is one of them, guinea worm is another. And the hope is that we'll really be able to drive them out of existence. And we will be able to save not just the current generation from ever having to experience those terrible diseases, but all future generations will profit from the successful eradication of these diseases. And I think that there's a couple really important lessons there. One is that infectious diseases can be enormously disruptive. I think COVID makes it excruciatingly clear that it is among the most severe threats that we could possibly face. But as the polio eradication has taught us, we can also accomplish amazing things in public health when we set our minds to it, and we can really change the course of history. And so I think there's enormous promise and hope in that as well. It's just a matter of really putting our minds to it and putting the effort and the commitment and the perseverance behind it that we need in order to get to a better place.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for that grounded yet hopeful introduction to our, hopefully informative yet very fun program tonight. Thank you for joining us. And with that, I hope that everybody enjoys the show.
Thanks. Enjoy your evening.